Here we are, punters, back with part two, and I finished part one there with a story out of a book, and I'll start part two with the same thing. I haven't got it here. I've obviously moved that book on, but it was a book called Against All Odds, I think. It's Bill Waterhouse's autobiography, and something that always sticks with me, and I regularly remind myself of it, particularly when I'm having a bit of a tough run. There's a paragraph in that book somewhere where Bill says, when things are running against you, you're going to feel like you're never going to win again. And what you have to do is stick to your process. You know, if you've got a good process and one that's worked for you over a period of time, you've got to stick to it. Do the things that you know work. Don't get thrown off track. Don't alter your behaviour too much. Make minor adjustments and just stick to it. And amazingly, when the wheel turns and you have that winning day and put a bad run to an end, you can often then very quickly feel like you're never going to back another loser. So it's amazing how the great game will drag you one way and then another. But I think they're very sage words from Bill Waterhouse, who is one of the game's great survivors. So where are we? I thought I'd just talk a little bit about, we don't get a chance to do this often enough, about some of the betting in some of the races over the weekends, and it's the sort of thing I wish got more coverage, and it'd be great if the media got involved in it and learnt who the big teams are and the characters are, and tried to motivate them to be more like the big poker players and be willing to talk about some of the big moves they make and why they made them and what happened. And I think that would do a lot for racing, but it's not something that's on the horizon. But at Moonee Valley on race 1 on Friday night, I think the big teams used Kobayashi. They backed him in the afternoon, probably 3 or 4 hours from the race, to get him into a price that meant both experimentation and Miraqueb were going to start where they wanted them to start when the main on-course and last 20 minutes of betting started. I should say when the VOP kicked in. I'm not saying that they didn't expect Kobayashi to win, but I think their main target in that race was experimentation, and their secondary target was Miraqueb. And they used that early betting move to put Kobayashi in a position where he was taking up a significant chunk of the market, over 30%, which then meant that the other two runners had to be prices where they wanted them. The other thing of interest in that race was the run of Coruscate. He ran 4th. He did not parade very well, and I think that horse has got an awful lot of improvement, so he's an interesting runner. Then the big go of the night, without any doubt, was Hootson. They'd obviously marked her extremely short. I was way off the mark. I marked her $1.80, I think, and sort of expected her to trade around that range, but they'd obviously had her marked extremely short, and all of them, and they decided not to wait until the VOP kicked in and to just mop up every bit of every price down to about $1.40. And in the end, were they right? I don't know. Maybe she was $1.50 chance. So that's always hard at that end of the market. That's not my specialty, getting those ones at the pointy end of the market right all the time. I mean, at that odds-on range. Then there was race 4, which is very interesting. Again, I think the teams used Modernity and to a lesser extent the Hawks runner to get... Super 2 was very popular with the rank and file punters, so she was always very firm in the market. And I don't think the big teams wanted that. They wanted to hold her out near that 7-4 mark, so they started chipping away at Modernity an hour or so before the race, and just a few other runners to try and hold Super 2 out at longer than 6-4. But as soon as they got a chance, when the real betting started, they just chimed right into her, and late there was unlimited for her late. So very interesting there, and Super 2 was no doubt the main target in that race. And over to race 5 on Friday night. I'm just pointing at this one because it just shows that they're not always right. They do have malfunctions, as DK likes to call them. Now, this wasn't a huge malfunction, but a minor one. They decided in race 5 that they were definitely going to save on foundation, so they kept foundation rock solid in the market. And they were happy with that, and they were trying to set up a position on Tavago. I think they were maybe beaten to the punch a bit by some stable money that got the ball rolling, but then they just kept coming, and Tavago was the main target. And the victim, from a market point of view, in all that mix was Jon Snow, who just kept drifting until very late in betting, and he got out to a remarkably good price. I mean, I had half of my bet, I can tell everyone, on Friday, I'm not sure what time it was, at about $6. So to see him SP at 9.50 is just shows you what can happen when enough of the big teams line up on a particular runner, or if they let one go. So anyway, I mean, I could talk about all the races over the weekend, and these sort of moves are happening, and all that thing. It's a very interesting part of the great game, and it doesn't get enough coverage in the main media, and it seems to be just an area that is not being explored at all. And I think there's so much there for punters, and if it was written about and there was more identification of Dr. Nick's team and the Bartholomew's and even Jelko's team and what they do, I think punters, a lot of them, particularly the ones that are very active in the game and betting a lot, would find it very interesting, and it would give organisations like Racing.com the opportunity to build their audience from the inside out, rather than always trying to build it from the outside in, which is just a failed model, and they keep banging their head up against that same brick wall. But and that's just my opinion. Also, while I'm here, I want to give a big shout out to great friend of the show, great friend of mine. You won't meet a more loyal and decent bloke than Michael Thomas, and he's the owner and breeder of Happy Clapper. There's an excellent article about Michael in today's Australian, and about his horse and about the whole family, and how he originally sold the mare to Darley for $40,000, but then managed to buy her back off them for $13,000 when she was already in foal with what turned out to be Happy Clapper. So, I mean, that's just an amazing story. Never been a more deserved horse to win a Group 1 than Happy Clapper. He's run into Winks a number of times and other good horses, and then wet tracks, and he finally got his day in the sun there on Saturday. So a good story all round, and absolutely delighted for Michael and the Websters and the whole team there. So the other book that I just brought along today was Fortune's Formula. I've mentioned it a few times. Now I'm getting back in reverse again. William Poundstone. So that's a really good examination of the Kelly criteria, and which is, basically what I use. I use a modified version and basically bet at about a 5% of the Kelly bet. It doesn't really matter if you're using it and you are betting proportional to the full Kelly bet. It doesn't really matter what proportion you use, as long as you always use the same proportion. And the closer you get to 100% of the Kelly bet, the more volatile your results are going to be. It'll be a wild ride if you go to that length. But one of the great parts of that book that is really worth understanding for punters is the section on overbetting. So in that recent podcast that Jake Williams did with Victor from the investment bank, he talked about an experiment he ran where I think the dividend was $2.20 on a coin toss, or was it? No, it was a 60-40 coin toss. Sorry, that's what it was. And what the right bet was, and it was, basically 20% was the full Kelly bet. If you were, going to bet to the maximum, probably more sensible to bet 10% to get to the target that he'd set in that example. But the important part to note is if you go over that 20%, you don't have to go very far over it at all before you are a mathematical certainty to bankrupt yourself, to bankrupt your bank. So even though you've got an edge in the coin toss of you're winning 6 out of every 10, if you overbet that edge, you will bankrupt your bank. It's a phenomena that is absolutely critical that punters get their head around it. So it's something that, I spend a lot of time reading that chapter and understanding it, and I always tend to err on the side of being a little bit conservative, because I know that being too aggressive, no matter how big your edge is, unless your edge is 100%, if you overbet it, you will be on a very slippery slope. So that's worth an examination as well. Punters, we're into the spring, The footy's over. Things couldn't be more exciting. The form's shaping up beautifully. There's nothing but good times ahead for us punters for the next 6 weeks, and it's going to get better every week. Cheers, punters.